Welcome to this session on Zainul Abedin and the modern art movement in what was East Pakistan before and what is Bangladesh now. I am very happy to have Salima Hashmi with us, who does not need an introduction, but for those of us who I'm sure in a significant minority who don't know who she is, artist, art historian, activist, and much else besides. So Salima, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm deeply grateful to you for the time that you've taken.
Delighted.
The reason why we picked on this topic as opposed to something else, and I'm sure there'll be others along the way as we go along later in the year, is that when we talk about art in Pakistan, basically we talk about Abdurrahman Chughtai, we talk about Ustad Allah Bakhsh, we talk about Sadiqain, we talk about Shakir Ali, we talk about the Lahore Art Circle, we talk about art in the 50s and the 60s in Lahore and Karachi. But less and less as we go along, we talk about Dhaka and Chittagong. And I think those were very, very important places in Pakistan, together with Karachi and Lahore, where a lot was going on in the art space. And there was a lot of interaction between the artists from Dhaka and from Chittagong and from Lahore and from Karachi. So it is a part of our history, which I think is sadly being put in a corner. So let us begin. In 1933, a young man, not quite 18, steps off the train at Howrah station in Calcutta. Zainul Abedin has traveled from his village in Kishorganj to enroll at the government art school, which has awarded him a scholarship, without which he could not really have made it that far. The nationalist movement is gaining traction, and the Calcutta art scene is also buzzing with activity. The two main trends that the young Zainul Abedin would have to deal with are the Neo-Bengal School led by Gaganendranath Tagore and his favorite pupil, Mr. Nandalal Bose. And basically, on the other side, what Jamini Roy is doing in popularizing folk art in Calcutta at that time. So let's have a look at what's going on in the art scene at that point in time. This is Mr. Mukul De painting in Calcutta. He is the principal of the Government School of Art, an alumnus of Vishwabharati Shanti Niketan, and a very important figure in there. There is Rabindranath Tagore. There is Abanindranath Tagore. There is Gaganendranath. Then there's Hemandranath Mazumdar, and there is Nandalal Bose on the right. There is Ramkinkar Baij, junior artist, but coming on the scene. And there is Jamini Roy. So this is the environment in which this young man finds himself. And these are the things, these are the two trends basically that he has to deal with. He paints, he wins awards for this kind of thing. I do apologize because I've taken this from a book. I didn't have anything else to hand. So he's painting not a million miles away from what's going on, but of course you can see that there is a bit of difference, there is a bit of an experimentation. That's fine. Salima, I just want to at this stage ask you, what do you think is Zainul's relationship with the Bengal School? And we'll try and develop on that later.
Well, I think that we're assuming that he was not subjected to what was far more usual at the Calcutta School of Art, which was a much more representational style which had been put into place by colonialism. And therefore it had to do with volume, it had to do with direction of light, it had to do with the handling of if he was doing watercolor with the sort of Western tradition. Or if he was working in oils, then he was working in the sort of Western traditional oil painting style, if you like. So, and which is what actually what drove out the Tagore's and, under Havel's influence, when they decided to depart from the Calcutta School of Art and go off to, to Kala Bhavan and to go to Shanti Niketan and all the rest of it, because it was a rejection of what they were being subjected to in the classroom. But what did they assume? They assumed that what they were heir to was the classical Indian tradition, which of course was not oil on canvas. It was going to be water-based mediums. And in a way, it tied in very nicely with the Swadeshi movement, which was a rejection of industrial goods that were flooding the Indian market and so on and so forth. I have to, before I sort of launch forth any further, have a little disclaimer here. Because I think that, although they advise always against having any disclaimers when you're having a chat on something that you feel keenly about, the fact is that, not knowing Bengali, I feel that I am not privy to what must have been now quite a large amount of writing in Bengali about the period that we're talking about. And we've really had access to texts in English. But we can look at the work which informs us. The other thing is, of course, that I am not an art historian. I'm just happen to be somebody who was growing up in Lahore in the years that you're talking about. So 47 to 71, and I was lucky enough to have a ringside seat. So there was this sort of close-up, if you like, of a development. And there was this mutual connection with many of these people. So the Calcutta School really, to my mind, and Calcutta itself, was very colonial. The Bengal School was a rejection of it, and it was going back to the romance of the past. And then you have the other things that were happening alongside, which we should not forget that this is a time of great turmoil. Bengal most of all, because that is where the whole movement, the nationalist movement, took over. And that is, it sort of was going hand in hand with the rise of revolutionary movements, with the idea of, the development of the Communist Party of India. It was about going to the people. And in the midst of this, you have Zainul Abedin, who is, I think, making up his mind as to where, he's amazingly deft, wonderful draftsman, a great observer. Mm-hmm. So these things hold him in good stead, and, he wins a gold medal, and that turns a spotlight on him. And that for a young man that age must have been quite something. But then he kind of forgoes that and starts looking elsewhere. So I think the relationship to the Bengal School is not a romance with the Bengal School. I think it is an understanding of it, learning from it, but very firmly turning away from it, because I think he was a realist. He was politically conscious. I have to sort of say over here, John Berger once said that, I'm always blamed for dragging politics into art. But in fact, art has dragged me into politics.
Well, you can't not.
And I think that, you can't...
you can't not, and I think that's absolutely...
Yeah. You can't imagine Zainul Abedin, tremendous artist that he was, not being sensitive to the realities of the politics and all that was happening in Bengal at the time, and how they were informing this young man about his future directions. So his relationship with, Bengal School is not as chummy, if you like.
No, it's not, and there's tension there, as you rightly point out. There is tension there. This is what is happening. Where do I go, etc.
Yeah.
So now let's turn to the huge event that brings a lot to the fore. In 1943, as we know, this happens.
Yeah.
The Bengal Famine is a horrifying episode of human misery.
Yeah.
And it is very difficult, in my view, to look for aesthetic finer points when this is what is happening on the
Mm.
roads and the pavements outside.
Yeah.
And the Bengal famine, I think, to my mind, is significant enough for people to start responding to it in various ways, whether it's political, whether it's at the level of theater, whether it's the level of painting, whether it's the level at the level of music, they respond to it. But it is the response that makes it very interesting. This
Mm.
is what the Communist Party's main guy reports on the Bengal famine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of
Chitta
course, you
Gopal.
can see there is some anti colonial stuff here. There is the
Mm.
Bengal famine, Jallianwala Bagh, 1952, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And there are these woodcut type things with these
Mm.
peasants and stuff. Interestingly, and I think this goes to your point about the Bengal school, that's what we see out of the Bengal school in response to the famine
Mhm.
is this.
Mm.
It's it's basically a bit soft relative to the tragedy that is happening around
Mm.
you because they are still stuck, I think, in my mind, in that kind of sort of soft and sad and quasi romantic thinking.
Mm. Mhm.
And this is what they do. This is another person, which is Gobardhara and Ash. This is what
Mhm.
he does. And as you can see, it's a nice picture, but really it could have been painted at any time. This is not about the family. And this is what our friend Mr. Zainul Abedin does.
Yeah. Yeah.
In my view, and I may be wrong, and please help me with this. It is very difficult, as I said, to look for aesthetic things or art things in something that is so horrifying.
Mm.
But Zainul Abidin subverts the tradition that has been going on, in which he is studying through these paintings at the formal level as well.
Yeah.
You see how the elongated limbs are put, put, put in the picture. You
Mm.
see the spatial organization of the canvas, which basically concentrates on the misery. And
Mm.
interestingly, most of the Bengal famine paintings are about women and children.
Mm. Mm.
The, there's very few in which you don't have women and children, and
Mm.
they are dying. And there is this
Mm.
no, wonderful is not the right word to use. There is this very touching representation in
Mm.
that of the Madonna and child, which I
Mm.
showed earlier on, which is this one. So
Yeah.
he's basically not only painting a subject, he is
Mm.
painting it in a completely different way
Yeah.
to what has been happening before him. So
And
would
I
you
think
agree with that?
we must keep in mind that he's also part of a group. You just mentioned IPTA, and there was a Progressive Writers Association, and there were these alliances.
Yeah.
And of course, his first images were shown in the Communist Party headquarters, and the party had already by this time, was talking about the People's
Yes.
War. And from what one reads, that groups, when they made so many copies of these and the other drawings, the Chitta Bazar drawings, Somnath Hore was part of that group, and so on. And these drawings went out to exhibitions all over the place, Bengal. But interestingly, they also came to the Punjab. They came to the Punjab in this group which they called
Mm-hmm.
Punjabi Yatra, and they carried these drawings, and there were
Mm-hmm.
6,000 copies of these images, these and the others. And they sold them at 4 annas a piece or whatever, and raised money to help with these conditions. So it was very
Mm-hmm.
much part of a realization that the artist has a role to play in times like these. So, and I think this is something that you feel over and over again in Zainul's approach to life, to work, that he is in, I don't want to use the word service, but he is in close quarters with people at large, his people, and in the widest sense of the word. And therefore, that is something that one follows in his later career also. Um, to me, it's very significant that it was part of a turbulence in which he plays his role as an artist in a movement.
Yeah, and I think it's a period,
Hmm.
the life he lives, the years in which he lives that life
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
is full of significant events. He's born during the First World War.
yeah,
He sees the Second World War. He sees the Bengal famine. He sees the independence movement. He
yeah.
sees Bangladesh being created. And he
Mhm.
dies 5 years after the creation of Bangladesh. And the sensitivity of the man is it's very, you're very right to point that out, because whenever there is a movement
Mhm.
talking about any kind of oppression or addressing any kind of oppression or hoping to get rid of it, Zainul is always painting that, whether
Yeah,
it's the language riots
yeah,
or it is the liberation movement or it's Palestine,
yeah,
right? I mean,
yeah,
he's quite involved in that. And
yeah.
but the interesting thing is that when, in my view, the other thing that he's very famous for is this, which is the Santhal peasantry that he paints.
Yeah, yeah.
Unlike the others, in my view, and perhaps you can, and I'm sure you can shed some color on this. This is just one painting, but most of them have a few features,
Mm,
which is that the figures, the spatial organization of the canvas is such that the figures completely dominate the visual field. And the nature that they are in daily struggle against and in daily contact with is dwarfed by the sheer dimension of the human being.
mm,
And
yeah.
that you see through and through. The other thing that comes across in the Santhal paintings, for which he is rightly very famous, other than the brush stroke, the line, and all the rest of it, is that invariably the figures do not look at the viewer to affirm their existence.
Mm,
They go on with their life. The
mm,
artist is here an observer of things.
mm,
And so are you, anyone who's
mm.
looking at it. So I think this interesting, it is not a romantic notion of the peasantry,
No,
in
it's
my view.
heroic. I would call it heroic.
It is,
You know.
it's heroic.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
heroic, more heroic. And then you see that in the other paintings about the bull and the labor and all that. I mean, this is his bull, which is
yeah.
famous,
Mhm,
and this is people working,
mhm.
right, or a person working.
This is
So
this
there
is
is
work that I
this
find
strength,
very
this is
interesting.
heroism. It's not
This
the
is very
sadness
interesting
that
because
accompanies it. So what?
this work in particular I'm very intrigued by, because in terms of the language that it employs, the language it employs is language in which there are volumes. You will notice, it is in that way that, okay, there's a tonal
Yeah, yeah,
treatment of the
yeah,
body, there's a
yeah,
tonal treatment of the animals, there is light against
yeah.
dark, so it is rounded out. Now I was looking earlier at a work done in the same year as this particular work, which is totally different in its vocabulary. Again, has the same motive of two figures, and they're pulling boats, it seems, because they're treated totally
Yes,
differently.
yes.
They're absolutely flat. So I think that
Mhm.
for somebody, an artist of this great caliber is someone who has the ability to really switch his way of working. And this is something that we notice, in the 50s when he starts traveling, when he goes to the West, he goes to the Slade for 2 years. And then we find that he has a choice of vocabulary, of how to actually approach his picture making. And that to me
Yeah.
is very fascinating, because it's not incidental. Here was this
No.
great man, because he is a great artist. So he has the ability really to try out, sometimes in quite playful ways, the things that are at his command. And that to me is the joy of discovery in Zainul Abidin's oeuvre. Um,
You're absolutely right, because if you look at some of the later work, there are things where which could have been called paintings, which could have been called Hello Jamini Roy. There are
mm,
those kinds of things as well.
yes, yes,
There are paintings which are sort of cubist type experiments. I
yeah, yeah.
personally don't think they're that great, but there are those cubist type experiments there as well. He's
Mm,
trying, but he keeps on going back to the countryside, to
mm,
Memon Singh. to the fishing boats, to the peasantry, because that is something that he has grown up with.
Mhm.
And I think that one of the reasons, going back to the famine series, is when he leaves Kishorganj,
Mhm.
whatever he needs to paint, he's painting from memory,
Mhm. Yeah.
because he spent a lot of time looking at these things when he's as a boy, as an adolescent. And the Bengal famine is the first time when he has an opportunity to paint from reality in
Mhm.
Calcutta.
Yeah.
And he grabs it, and he grabs it with as strongly as he can. So basically, now we see the next phase is that he comes to Pakistan in 1947 8, or East
Mhm.
Pakistan. And then art, in terms of his own production, takes a slightly less important, plays a slightly less important role in his
Yeah.
life. He gets busy in establishing institutional,
Yeah.
institutional framework for the development of art in Pakistan.
Yeah.
So, and I think this is something he paints, but and then he gets a job in the information department. He has no problem with that,
Mhm.
provided they can deliver to him what he wants. He
Mhm.
starts a small art school in Dhaka, which then becomes the Faculty of Fine Art
Yeah.
at Dhaka University many years
Yeah.
later.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that he was a tremendous institution builder. That was his
Yeah.
instinct. And with the art school in Dhaka, I was talking the other day to good friend Shahidul, who was telling me about certain things that he insisted on. For example, that the students should learn from real life, not talking about the human body, talking
Mhm.
about establishing a zoo there
Mhm.
so that they could actually look at
Yes.
the animals and study the animals. And then there was a pond where you had the birds and you had the ducks, so that the students were encouraged as part of the pedagogical stance to not paint from imagination to the extent that students are apt to do very, very quickly, but more to really look at what is there. And I think, talking about, okay, there's that
I
whole
think we've
streak of
frozen. Yeah.
going back to going back to um, going back to the village, going back to real people. It was also really studying in the heart of the city, looking at other forms that were
Yeah.
natural forms. And it's very interesting because in Lahore, with the National College of Arts, the transformation of Mayo School into National College of Arts, again, students were taken out to the Lahore Zoo and were told to paint and draw from that. And as you know, Zainul Abedin was on the board of governors of the National College of Arts and a great
Yes.
friend
Yes.
of Shakir Ali, the
Yes. Yes.
principal. So there was this sharing of, I think, of their interests in approaches to pedagogy. Um, and I mean, his tremendous contribution in Pakistan remains the setting up of the Fine Arts Department at Peshawar University. And I was told by
Yes.
somebody who used to be a student in those days, former diplomat, Shafkat Kaka the other day, he said, what a presence he was. And he kept going back to Peshawar because I remember that I was a student at NCA, and he would arrive in Lahore. He would stay at our house very often, and then he'd go off to Peshawar and spend days there. And he really, I mean, he started. It was a new university, and he started it from scratch. He had a team, which was Jamila Zafar, and later Jamila Zaidi, who was his sort of assistant. And later she sustained it, once it got going, then she carried on as the head of the department. But he put the vision in place. He was a person, and he carried great clout. I think this is something that we in Pakistan, you know, don't don't really remember so well. But Zainul Abidin was a person who the bureaucrats listened to. He had the negotiating abilities, and he had a certain presence, and therefore
Yes.
he would, his word carried weight. He knew how to set up things like. a new department in a fledgling university, as I'm sure he did in Dhaka too. I mean, he had this, great contribution there in the east, what we call the Eastern Wing, but also in the West. He's left a lasting legacy. I don't know now how far both these places carry his imprint. Whether the pond is still there, I don't know. Whether the zoo is still there.
Well,
but the
hence
fact
we are
remains,
talking about these things.
but the fact remains that he was the one.
No.
The Shalpacharya.
Yeah. And also, I mean, isn't it? It's curious that it's interesting, not curious, that both him and Shakir Ali are playing similar roles at the same sort of time, generally, which is promoting art, promoting younger artists, promoting newer ways of doing things. Even if the artists are very different from the practice of the mentor, but it's very interesting, and this is the time. And particularly, you're right. Zainul Abedin can effectively negotiate the establishment of an art school with a military government. So be it. I think it's full marks to the military government that is doing this, right? Or it's doing some things that we don't like.
But as a teacher, I also see these things outlast.
As a teacher,
these things outlast the dictator. Okay, and his pedagogy, was firm.
Oh, absolutely.
You mentioned earlier, his interest in folk art, his folk forms, which continued, when Bangladesh became Bangladesh. But before that, it was, NCA, National College of Arts, undertook the travels into Swat Valley. And he was very much an instigator, in that milieu in which there was Professor Sponenberg, the principal, Shakir Ali, and Zainul Abedin. And they were the people who really turned the face of the new design and art school and said, look at the people, look at what they do, go into the villages, look at the craft.
No, and these things have to be remembered.
Yeah. So that is something that is important.
Yeah. Now I'd like to turn to something which I think is also hugely important, which is that under Zainul Abedin's sponsorship, under Zainul Abedin's patronage, if you like, through his encouragement, very active, and because of his ability to negotiate with the powers that be, a massive modern art movement starts or effectively happens in East Pakistan at that time. And let's look at some pictures and then we can talk about it. SM Sultan is a contemporary, fine, and he's there. Then there is people like Qayyum Chaudhry, and you can see their styles are very different. And these guys some are going west, some are going east to learn. And he helps them, and he says, "Yeah, paint. This is Kibriya." Again, these are all people who are around that the art college that he establishes at some Aminul Islam, Devdas Chakraborty, Amrul Hassan, Jahangir, who spent a lot of time, incidentally, in Pakistan as well, living and painting and all the rest of it. As Murtaza Bashir, whom, as you told me in one of our last conversations, that lived in Lahore for a long time. And, apparently you attended his first exhibition in Lahore and bought a painting, what you told me, if memory serves. There is Nuvera Ahmed, who was a sculptor, again, one of the people around and in the college there. Hamidur Rahman, Rashid Chaudhry, who does a lot of, who was living in Lahore and who does a lot of work on fabric, right? So it's a legacy, and it's something that we seem to pay less attention to as we go along. And I think, just because a political event has taken place, it is foolhardy on our part to, if not outright stupid, to just ignore this part of our history.
Well, I think
which
that
is the history of Pakistan.
You're very, very right. I mean, I think that, Iftikhar Dadi has mentioned the fact that While
Mhm.
it was a very unequal relationship between West Pakistan and East Pakistan, politically as well as economically. But
That is true.
interestingly, in the cultural field, you find that, you know, what was then East Pakistan absolutely was the dominant wing, because I was growing up at the time. I was a young art student, and then later young teacher, and we felt that the eastern wing of the country was so much more sophisticated in what they were doing. I mean, okay, we had Lahore Art Circle and all of that, but somehow, I mean, I want to describe to you when, as a student at NCA, I went to the Lahore Museum where the national exhibition was happening, 1961, and all the top
Mhm.
prizes went to artists from the Eastern Wing. And the other day, I was just talking to a researcher who's, former student and scholar, and I told her that I stood in front of this painting, which had won first prize, I think.
Yeah.
And I said, I seem to remember that it was by Qayyum Chaudhary. And I even remember the
Okay.
painting. Okay, this is 1961, and I don't even want to think at how ancient I am today. And there I was, transfixed by this work and the utter beauty of it. And I remember the colors. And then I went from one work to the other, and there they were, all prize winners. And we felt just so overwhelmed by the sophistication and the beauty of what we were looking at. And at the entrance to the exhibition, there was the winner in sculpture, which was Novera Ahmed. The work was The Child Philosopher. And it was as you entered the exhibition, you saw this. And we were absolutely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So as far as we were concerned, we had to build on what we were looking at. And that was a wealth of
Sure.
idiom, a wealth of imagery, an amazing um, influx of ways of looking and, well, interpreting the world. Novera Ahmed at the time had her studio in Lahore. And one heard stories about how she was not terribly welcome in Dhaka, where they felt that, she was a little bit too big for her boots, maybe, or they felt that her way of working was very brash. She was supposed to be working in, how should I put it? Uh, she was working in non-feminine ways. This is what one gathered. And the reason was
Yeah.
that she was working in cement. She was working in concrete. In Lahore, nobody asked her what
Mm.
she was doing, and she was a recluse, very respected. Didn't talk very much to other artists. We admired her as students. We admired her tremendously. And I remember as a first year student, I thought, okay, when I grow up, I want to be like Novera Ahmed, as beautiful as her and as remarkably talented as her. And I remember her solo exhibition in Lahore. And we went, and we were really, as they say in English, we were gobsmacked by what we saw, because it was so ahead of its time. It was so ahead of its time. It's totally avant-garde. So for us, so much of our imagination of what the world could hold for the modern movement came from the connections that occurred at that time between the Eastern Wing and the Western Wing. Devdas Chakrabarti had his solo exhibition in Lahore. And I remember that I was told that, my father was hanging up the paintings because the carpenter had not come. So, that was
Yeah.
a kind of informality. Murtaza Bashir,
Yes,
of
of
course,
course.
was a permanent fixture in Lahore. And yes, I bought my first painting, which I had made some money from acting on a play, and I had 300 rupees, and the painting was for 500. But I batted my eyelids, and I was young and pretty, so he gave it to me, and I still have it on my mantelpiece. It hangs above there. It was from his Florence period, and he was a person who worked the way that he worked, again far ahead of its time, his printmaking. And there I have to say that perhaps the greatest milestone for the Lahore collection, which is still there in the Permanent Art Gallery, is in fact the prints that came from Dhaka. So there were the etchings and dry points, there were the wood engravings. I mean, there was, Safiuddin Ahmed, there were all these people whose work, and there was nobody who could match this level of skill in printmaking. So I think that the contribution to our sensibilities as young people was acute, and it continued really until what happened, when the 1970 happened. But before that,
Yeah.
if you look
When
at
it,
Zainul Abedin's work, I mean, that is tremendous because as you said, he marks every event, whether it is a language movement, whether it is, the movement of 69, whether it is the terrible flood, and then it's 71. So I think that,
there is the cyclone painting from
yes, exactly.
the 1971.
Yeah, the 70 flood, and his big scrolls that we don't have access to and we've only seen as reproductions. But they are, that I think also he was a great traveler. So one reads about his traveling to different parts of the world. I think he brought back to Dhaka these winds of change. Um, I think that the younger artists gained a great deal from what he brought back. And what you said, earlier about his sort of the Cubist period, I think that was very conscious. He wanted to he wanted to experiment. He wanted to experiment. He wanted to see how by wiping out the three-dimensional and treating the pictorial space as a flat space, how could he arrange the figures in that? And I think his experiments, or his parallel really to his other paintings, I think they informed a lot of work that you've just shown of the younger artists. He opened that pathway for them to look at the pictorial space.
No,
as
the
a flat
pathway to
space.
think, to imagine, to execute, experiment. I think, yes. So, Salima, I'm so grateful to you for having shared your thoughts with us.
Mhm.
And, as you well know, the writing of history is a matter of inclusion and exclusion. It
Mhm.
depends on the point of view of the historian, the world that he or she is trying to construct for us. However, this exclusion with the passage of time has cost us a lot in terms of our identity, in terms of our heritage, in terms of our legacy. I just hope that for our younger viewers, there are a few of them at least around, that it makes a little difference to them in terms of thinking about the history of Pakistani art. And hopefully, it will also encourage them to go to the museum and see some print work that you talk about, or look at Zainul Abidin's pictures in book things. And think of Zainul Abidin, Kibriya, Murtaza Bashir, Novera Ahmad, Aminul Islam, all these people as part of the artistic, aesthetic, cultural heritage of what is Pakistan today. And on that note, I thank you deeply and I thank you very much. And hopefully we shall meet again. And thanks are also due to Razi and Iman for having organized this. And that's it. So, a very good afternoon to you, and hopefully we shall meet again on another subject. Thanks once more.
Thank you. Thank you.